There is a silence that lives within us, not the silence of peace, but of absence, the absence of self. Have you ever asked yourself how many parts of you had to be hidden just to be accepted? How many times did you smile when you wanted to cry? How many times did you agree just to avoid rejection? How many times did you adapt so much that you no longer knew who you were? Maybe shame doesn't scream. Maybe it just settles in, like an invisible layer between you and the world. You learned to wear a mask, not out of vanity but out of survival. And little by little that mask stopped being a disguise and became a face. What you hide in order to survive might be silently killing you. Jean-Paul Sartre once said we are condemned to be free, free to choose, free to become whoever we wish to be. But with that comes the weight of being solely responsible for everything we become. And then the paradox appears. Because the more free we feel, the more terrified we are by the idea of showing who we really are. Maybe that's why we try to please, try to fit in, try to be what others expect, even if it costs us our truth. But there is a price to this performance. And it's not rejection from others, it's self-abandonment. Because every time you hide yourself, it's as if you say to your own heart, I'm not enough as I am. And that thought, repeated in silence, plants roots deep within the soul. Shame then becomes a prison, but not a prison made of iron, a prison of reflections, where everything you see no longer seems to be you. Are you ready to remember who you were before you hid? If you'd like, I can walk with you, but only to the door. The rest is between you and your truth. At first it's almost imperceptible, a glance you lower, an opinion you swallow, a discomfort you choose to silence. You tell yourself it's just this once, but little by little, repetition becomes habit, and habit becomes identity. You start to disappear around the edges. You begin to fade, to mold, to fit, until one day you look in the mirror and don't recognize yourself. It's not that you suddenly got lost, it's that you lost yourself gradually, one piece at a time. Shame doesn't arrive like an explosion, it arrives like dust. It gathers in the corners without warning. It starts covering your desires, your impulses, your authenticity. It settles like an emotional virus, silent, subtle, contagious. Because when you learn that showing who you are brings pain, the body learns to protect itself. You molded yourself, not because you wanted to, but because you thought you had to. You weren't born this way. This insecurity, this compulsive adaptation, this feeling of inadequacy, they were learned. They were absorbed along the way as unconscious defenses in a world that perhaps never truly welcomed you. And the cruelest thing about this armor is that it works. It protects. It allows you to be accepted, but at the same time, it robs you. It steals your spontaneous laughter, your sincere opinion, the necessary no, your authentic presence. You survived, but at what cost? Maybe it's time to remember that what you silenced in order to belong still pulses inside you, waiting to be heard. Before the mind understands, the body already knows. It feels first. It feels the discomfort that has no name. It feels the tension with no apparent cause. It feels the weight of a silence that settled in before you even noticed. Your throat tightens, your chest contracts, your stomach closes, as if every part of your body were trying to speak what you learned to hide. The body doesn't lie. It is the first to react when the soul is silenced, when emotion is suppressed, when truth is suffocated. Neuroscience now recognizes what the heart has always known. The amygdala, the brain's emotional alarm system, registers shame as a real threat, as if revealing who you are were a risk to your survival. And so, even in safe environments, the body stays on alert, tense, restrained, ready to flee or go quiet. It's as if your truth is trapped somewhere in the body, screaming for release, without making a sound. Sometimes it's not about understanding, it's about feeling. Feeling where the knot is, feeling where the fear lives, feeling exactly where your soul is being held captive. Close your eyes for a moment, take 3 slow breaths, and notice whether your breath flows and/or meets resistance. Sometimes it's in that simple, almost imperceptible gesture that you reconnect with the thread of your own voice. Not the voice that speaks, but the one that feels. And maybe, just maybe, that's where the return begins. There are silences that heal, and there are silences that make us sick. Not every silence is peace. Some are prisons built with fear, with shame, with the mistaken belief that feeling is weakness. You learn to stay quiet to be loved, learn to hide to be accepted, learn that expressing pain threatens other people's balance. But what was left unsaid doesn't disappear. It transforms. It becomes tension, It becomes symptoms. It becomes repeating patterns you can't explain. Silence, when it doesn't come from presence, becomes a prison. An internal prison where you can see yourself, but not hear yourself. Where you perceive your existence, but don't allow yourself to fully be. Some say spirituality is learning to be silent, but maybe for some souls, healing lies in doing the opposite, in giving voice to what was never allowed to be said, in letting the shadow speak, letting anger be expressed, letting sadness cry. What needs to be heard isn't always beautiful, it isn't always light, but it's true, and everything that is true, when welcomed, transforms, not to please, not to convince, but to set itself free. Because a soul imprisoned by silence isn't looking for answers, it's asking for permission, permission to exist, permission to be felt, permission to finally breathe again. It's not always anger at others. Sometimes it's just exhaustion from having to pretend in front of them. The weight doesn't lie in loving. It lies in having to erase yourself in order to be loved. When you look at yourself through someone else's eyes and see only what they expect, not who you are, something inside you begins to wither. You smile, but don't recognize yourself in the smile. You say, "I'm fine," but something inside you screams that you're not. Coexistence turns into theater, and love becomes a stage of concessions. It's not that the other is the enemy, but they become the mirror of your own wound, of how much you abandon yourself to fit in, of how much you disguise yourself to avoid rejection. Nietzsche once said, "Become who you are," but that first requires destroying who you pretend to be. And that destruction is not violent. It is silent. It's the letting go of an image. It's mourning a character. It's the end of a facade built with the best of intentions. Because when you live to be accepted, you lose the chance to be true. And the cruelest part is that, even when you are accepted, the emptiness remains. Because it isn't you who is being loved. It's the version you created. And the soul knows. It has always known. Sometimes kindness is just fear in disguise. Fear of disappointing. Fear of being left behind. Fear of not being enough just as you are. Living to please doesn't begin with grand sacrifices. It begins with small silences. With the decision not to disturb. With the habit of smiling, even when everything inside you is falling apart. And little by little, you become a specialist in erasing yourself. You begin to predict what others expect. You become efficient at disappearing from your own truth. Adaptation, which once seemed like a virtue, becomes emotional despair, disguised as empathy. You don't choose what you feel, but you choose what you show. And often, you only show what the other wants to see. You become a reflection of someone else's desire, and you forget what it feels like to be a mirror of your own soul. There are subtle signs. You say yes often, but feel a no pulsing inside. You keep yourself constantly busy, just to avoid hearing yourself. You are praised for being easy to deal with, but you feel invisible, even to yourself. She smiled at everyone, but no longer remembered how it felt to smile for herself. That's the pain of living to please. You become loved by everyone, except by yourself, and shame feeds on that. On that silent pact where you agree not to fully exist in exchange for partial acceptance. But for how long? There are moments when the soul gets tired, not of fighting, but of pretending it doesn't feel. You ran so much. You adapted so much. You believed that if you just tried hard enough, the pain would go away. But maybe healing doesn't lie in understanding or in explaining. Maybe it lies in stopping the flight from yourself, because there's a part of you that never left, that remained there still quietly waiting to be found again. It's not about going back to the past. It's about going back to yourself, to stop running from what pulses at your core, even if it hurts, even if it's still confusing. Spirituality is not an escape. It's a safe place where you can feel, where pain can be held without haste, where shame loses its strength simply by being named. Close your eyes. Place a hand on your chest. Breathe slowly, not as an external ritual, but as a gesture of reconnection with what has been forgotten. And in that moment, when everything feels too quiet, something whispers from within, "I'm still here." Feeling is not weakness. It is an act of resistance in a world that rewards numbness. You still feel, even hidden, even repressed, even when you no longer believe in yourself. And that, in itself, is already strength. Shame only has power over those who believe they need to become someone else in order to be loved. But what if you no longer needed to perform? What if the love you've been searching for could only exist once you stopped betraying yourself? Courage is not about imposing yourself, it's about revealing yourself in the quiet of someone who decides to stop lying to their own heart. It's not a scream, not an external rebellion. It's a return, silent, deep, alive. Clarissa Pinkola wrote, "You were made for these times, not to survive them wearing masks, but to walk through them with truth, with soul, with wholeness. You don't need to have all the answers, but maybe for the first time, you need to stop hiding from the oldest question, who am I, when no one is watching? And in that question, the courage to return begins. You are free, free to think, to feel, to be. And yet, this freedom feels heavy, because being free means choosing. And choosing implies responsibility, and responsibility brings fear. Jean-Paul Sartre called it the condemnation to freedom, not because freedom is a punishment, but because it demands something few are willing to carry, the truth of the self. There is no one else to blame, no more excuses to hide. The mask is optional, the prison, voluntary, and it is in this space, between possible freedom and real fear, that the paradox is formed. The freer you are, the more you feel the weight of being yourself. You begin to realize that living in truth also means accepting the loneliness of not being understood, of not pleasing, of not meeting expectations. That's why many prefer the invisible chains of adaptation. They're lighter than the weight of being who you are, but there is something sacred in the silent choice to show up, not as a scream, not as rebellion, but as a firm whisper, I am, and that whisper echoes. It doesn't need an audience, it doesn't need validation, it exists for itself, and by itself it is enough. Maybe you were never truly lost, just hidden, out of protection, out of instinct, out of the need to be accepted. But even in hiding, your essence remained, like a small flame that never goes out, even when unseen. You tried to be strong, you tried to be functional, you tried to be everything the world asked of you, except yourself. And now perhaps you realize that living your truth isn't about confrontation, it isn't about rebellion, it's about liberation. Liberating yourself from the versions you created, from the masks you had to wear, from the fears you learned to normalize. You no longer need to fight to be accepted, because the soul doesn't want applause, it wants permission. Permission to be felt, permission to be imperfect, permission to exist, just as it is. Shame begins to dissolve when the light of presence touches the place it once occupied. When you look at yourself and no longer turn away, and then, as if waking from a long sleep, you find someone waiting for you, yourself. And maybe this is the kind of freedom that frightens, but also the only one that truly heals. You're still here, whole, even if in pieces, alive, even if tired, present, even if silenced. And the only question that remains in the depths of the silence is this: what if your essence never left you, but was only waiting for the moment when you'd finally come home?